Velkommen til en ny faglunsj om bærekraftig bytransport. I dag så slår vi på en stor tromme. For hva skal til for å skape verdens mest gåvennlige by? Og mye av det er kanskje også relevant hvis man skal utvikle en by eller tettsted til å bli i hvert fall litt mer gåvennlig. Vi har i dag med oss den internasjonale eksperten Jim Walker. Og her i studio har vi med oss to norske eksperter. Guro Berge, nå TØI, og også Marianne Knapskog fra TØI. Etter Walkers presentasjon så skal de komme med kommentarer og spørsmål. Men aller først så skal vi en liten tur ut i Oslos gater.
Vi skal bare gå litt rundt i byen. Vi har fri fra skolen i noen timer.
Nå er jeg på vei mellom to møter, så det er jobbgåing.
We're going to Hammelkochen, the jumping thing.
Nå bare fryder jeg meg over at nå ryddes det. Det ryddes til vår.
It's great. I mean, the streets, the communication, how they are described, like where to go, left, right, it's just so easy.
Eftersom jag bor på landet i Sverige så tycker jag det är skönt att komma till en by.
Jeg er ganske enig. Å gå i byen er veldig fint når det er fint vær og god stemning, men skogen passer jo selvfølgelig alltid bra også.
Vet du hva, jeg liker Oslo, for jeg bor i Jevnaker, så det er ikke så mye der, ikke sant?
Especially that there's no cars, so you can just walk and explore.
At least some English there at the end, Jim. Welcome to Bylunsj, Jim Walker. How are you today?
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to sharing a few thoughts with you about walkable cities.
You are joining us from outside London, aren't you?
Yeah, just a couple of hours outside London in the United Kingdom. We travel a lot, but at the moment it's sunny here, and I'm happy to be sitting still for a few minutes and sharing things with you.
You are the director of Walk 21 Foundation. What exactly is Walk 21?
Well, Walk 21 is an NGO. It's a charity registered in the UK where we work with cities all over the world to help improve their walkability. We're working with governments, practitioners, researchers, and communities to improve walking policies and walking projects anywhere in the world.
Your name is Walker. Does it ever happen that people don't comment on your name, Mr. Walker?
It's a very memorable name, as you say. Well, I've met a few people who've got these names that sort of linked to their jobs, but I must say it makes it easy. People never forget me. For the right reasons.
And now to today's topic, how to create the world's most walkable city. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, you've given me 15 minutes to tell you everything I've learned over about 25 years. So I'm going to be rushing through. Forgive me for that. But I wanted to share with you a few examples of cities around the world who've been having a go and a mechanism really about how I think you could do that most effectively so that every city in Norway could be as walkable as possible. And the first starting place is recognizing that, of course, pedestrians are everywhere. People are walking all the time in all our cities, and yet they're almost invisible because there's so many people doing it all the time. It's quite common to forget about where to see walking. And so it does take a commitment, and this actually is our first step. We've developed 8 steps to a walkable city, and I'd recommend these 8 steps as being a formula, as it were, that could be applied in an appropriate way in any place, certainly anywhere across Norway. And this commitment, it needs to be political, it needs to be involving the community. And I give you this example, this lovely picture of an band in Germany, in Munich. The mayor here wanted to encourage people to walk more. And so what he did was he hired an band and we all walked through the middle of the city, but we did it on a Friday at 5 o'clock during rush hour along the busiest street. to really get the people that he wanted to communicate, knowing that he was committed to walking. I thought that was fantastic. And what is that commitment? What we're really thinking about when we talk about walkable cities is about the need to support all the people walking already and to entice more short distance trips to be walked by people who have a choice to motorize instead. Remember, not everybody does have a choice, but if we can do that, then we will have a walkable place by making sure that we keep people walking already, protect people from ever getting hurt, and enable people to walk by improving accessibility and comfort. It's really that simple. That's simple, but step 2, make sure we do the research. I give an example here of a push button, although you'll see on this particular push button in Sydney, Australia, they encourage you not to push it during COVID. That was quite common in lots of places. But what we found when we did the research in Sydney, Australia, was that actually many of the people walking in the central business district of Sydney during the week, 50% of their time was spent waiting to cross the road. And that was because we found out that actually they disable these push button road mechanisms during the weekdays because they wanted to keep everybody moving. In reality, they were keeping traffic moving, but 90% of people were walking in the CBD and 50% of their time spent waiting to cross the road for the 10%. Clearly, the research proves things needed to change. And change is an interesting way how that sometimes happens. The research that happened here in Toronto, the shopkeepers were so tired of people parking outside their stores and blocking the streets from the market atmosphere that they had in Toronto, in this Kensington streets, that they actually dedicated one of their cars to become a mural, as it were, where people could write what they wanted to do with their cars, where they would rather the cars were. And they actually pushed this car to the town hall and said, look, this is what people want of our street. They don't want the cars here, which I thought was quite innovative, a way of doing your research about what people want from their walks. Step 3 is about involving people. And I picture here a child that we worked with in Medellin in Colombia. It wasn't safe to bring out mobile phones in this community, but in this community, which was only about 500 meters from where the mayor actually had his office, it was an area that was quite deprived. It was an area full of drug addicts and prostitutes, to be totally honest with you. And the mayor didn't want to be seen to be improving that neighborhood. But inside that same neighborhood was more than 2,000 children living, and they were 8 times more likely to be hit by a car than in other neighborhoods. We walked with them, gave them lollipops to put down where they felt they were happy, where they had a miserable experience. We digitized it, we mapped it. And the mayor actually then built sidewalks, he built parks, he built road crossings, and we reduced incidents of road crashes by 22% within 6 weeks. We've now since digitized that, and we'd love to share with you one day about how we might be able to create walkable cities using apps by engaging communities, involving communities at street level across the whole of Norway. Step 4 is about assessment. What we found in cities around the world, and here's a picture from Vienna, is that you do need to actually go out and find out what is that walking environment like. In Vienna, we did that because we found that actually in the retail areas, people were complaining that footfall wasn't as strong as it could be in certain parts. And what we did was, by closing the streets to traffic and opening them to people, effectively removing the cars from the main shopping streets, that actually the footfall went up, the dwell time goes up, and so does the spend. At the time, Maria Basilako, who was the mobility mayor of the city, was having death threats from these shopkeepers. Within 6 weeks of that street being closed, they had a 30% increase in their income to their shops. And it was the shopkeepers on the parallel streets who said to Maria, "Why haven't you done our street?" But we must be careful when we're thinking about streets. And here's an example from Hong Kong, that just because there's lots of people in them doesn't mean that they're walkable. We work with a lot of cities around the world which are full of people. Large numbers of people in Africa, for example, about 80% of cities in Africa, all the trips are being walked. But it doesn't mean that it's enjoyable. Hong Kong invited us in to actually help them because they said we've got 90% of people walking and using public transport in our city. Enviable for any city in the world, I would have thought. But they said it's actually the worst part of our day. They didn't enjoy it. And we worked with them for 3 years to work about how we could actually improve the enjoyment of the city whilst they were on their feet, which required quite some subtle changes. It's not just always about capacity. And likewise, if you search up for the most beautiful streets in the world, you might find a picture like this. This one, I think, is in Paris, probably quite famous. But it looks perfect, and I'm sure it's relatively nice to live there. But don't you notice how empty it is? Apparently, the only people who go here are people who want to take pictures for Instagram. And I think this is a challenge, that we can't just design everything perfectly by the playbook and imagine that it's just because it's walkable, it means that people are walking there. This is actually the complexity of the challenge that we all face. And I've developed this over the years as a sort of model of something that we have to think about, both at a city level, at a neighborhood level, maybe even at a street level, to actually identify the fact that there are different places which are maybe walked but not walkable, or walkable but not walked. And surely the top right is where we really want the most of our cities to be. And it takes different strategies. If you're trying to work on the orange sections or the red sections in order to bring as much of walking across your city to that top right corner, which is where we all desire to be. And of course, it needs a separate strategy to maintain that. So those different approaches are going to need investment and time. Step 5, and I said there are 8 steps, so I'm doing well. I think I'm rattling through in my few minutes here. And this is about reviewing. What we found in a number of cities is that they could develop a very good walking policy, but there were other policies that got in the way that were actually limiting their effectiveness of actually delivering. You might have some experience of this, I don't know. You have one of the best walking policies in the world. You were the first to develop one in Norway. So lots of people are very envious of your position. But the delivery takes time and it is challenging. Here's a picture from San Sebastian, Donostia, in northern Spain. And what the mayor found there was, yes, he had lots of people promenading around the main beach area, but there were cars everywhere. And he did for 20 years, he said, cars have to be underground. He only wanted cars to appear underground. He didn't want the car on the street because he said, in his mind, it was when people stepped out of their house every morning, if they saw their car, that's what they chose. And if you go to Donostia now, I think it's one of the most walkable and beautiful places to go and hang out and go for a walk, I must say. And interestingly, I was just in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and I spoke to the chief of mobility in Paris, and now they're doing the same thing. They've realized that there's enough underground car parking spaces for all the cars that come into Paris every day. So there's absolutely no need to provide on-street parking anywhere in the city. Those of you who know Copenhagen, they took away 10% of parking every year for about 20 years. No policy for that, but they just did that. And that's what made them as good for sustainable transport as they could. Paris is following suit by being really bold. They're going to take away all the on-street parking. And I don't know any city in the world that is truly walkable without having to make sure that they do something for the cars to manage traffic at the same time. Step 6 is the plan. Having assessed and reviewed and engaged and talked to people, actually putting things into a plan is so important. As I've mentioned, you've really inspired Norway. You've really inspired countries all over the world since your first strategy in 2013. And this is an example here in the Netherlands that just started in 2019. And what we see is that sometimes it's cities like Rotterdam who developed a great plan, who brought people together that actually inspired the national government. Sometimes it's the national government who inspire the cities. But here, more than 60 partners have got together and are working out answers to questions about how could the Netherlands be more walkable, let alone how can each city be as good as it can be. And I think there's some good examples now. This one from Queensland in Australia, where they decided to write a good, ambitious walking strategy. You see on the left-hand side, just a couple of years ago. They've since followed it up quickly with an action plan, more than 40 actions in it. And they've created a baseline framework to evaluate. And I think this 1, 2, 3 is exactly the sort of thing that now countries are following all over the place. And certainly cities are too. The 1, 2, 3, I think, is exactly the right way forward to make sure that you've got your commitments translated into actions and a clarity on whether or not they're being impactful. Step 7, and here's an example from Seoul in South Korea. We think this is about proving. We think signature projects can make a big difference to giving confidence to politicians as well as to practitioners about effective delivery. This, believe it or not, used to be a flyover. It's a flyover going right across the middle of the city, right out the side, the centre of the main railway station. And it was old concrete that was actually getting dangerous to drive over. But the mayor couldn't afford to take the concrete out and didn't know what to do with this infrastructure. And we decided to change it into a park. It's now a linear park cutting right through the city. It's filled with play areas, seating, trees, and in fact, all of the native plants from the whole of the region. And it's a wonderful place. I was there at the beginning, and within a week, I went to see the mayor, and he said, "What do you think? Has it been successful?" And I said, "Well, there's been over 1 million visitors in the first week to walking along this route." I said, "That is successful, certainly." And if we think about different cities around the world, you know, their signature projects. This was London. We developed a legible London wayfinding system that connected all the public transport system with the walking network. That was their project that put walking on the map some years ago now, but it meant that walking was visible in the budget, and that helped create a whole department inside Transport for London. In Bogota, Colombia, since 1974, I think it was, the Ciclovia movement meant that now more than 1.4 million people every Sunday come out and walk on more than 170 kilometers of roads that are just dedicated to walking and cycling every Sunday to reimagine their city. It's a fantastic example of reallocating road space. In Vienna, they recognized that lots of people were walking, but they weren't particularly thinking about it. They didn't really enjoy it so much. So they had a year of walking, and they got an extra 2% increase in walking in modal share just after years of activities about things like lead walks and lighting up buildings. But as well as that, they had a 60% increase in satisfaction about enjoying walking in the city that people somehow or other had forgotten, which I think is a really positive metric and something that really helped them with their sustainable urban mobility plan. And in Santiago de Chile, in Chile, the city didn't have very much money, but they recognized something needed to be done, but it was the businesses. This is Santander Bank that said their customers wanted to feel safe in the street, not just in the bank when they were with their money. And so it was the bank that the city gave permission to say, well, you change the street. And they painted it Santander red and put seating and lighting and various things around that made the whole atmosphere feel nicer outside the bank. And as you go a few steps down, you'll find it changes green into the Heineken area around a pub and things. But it's giving permission for businesses to think, and a sense of shared ownership of the streets seem to really work in Chile, and share the cost. And that is our final step, is about investment. Remembering that actually getting the priorities and demonstrating your priorities about putting pedestrians first is really what makes a walkable city. This example from Montreal, who are creating these snow clearances on the footpaths first. It demonstrates to the city, to the citizens, the young people, the older people, people with disabilities, women, who we all know walk most, that actually they care for them as much as they do about anybody else. It's very important. And as we found in Ireland, that they've allocated, and I think it's the most amount of money that's visible in the budget of anywhere in the world today. €1 million a day is being spent on walking in Ireland at the moment. And interestingly, the government doesn't have a plan, but they do have money to spend, and they are desperate for advice and support. And it's interesting that it's places like Norway looking at your plan where they're getting inspiration to think, where should they be spending their money on first? I haven't got longer to explain maybe more of the actions that are happening around the world, but I do think that this knowledge that can be gained from a process for wanting to deliver a walkable city can then help you choose the actions around campaigns and infrastructure, land use planning, integrating with public transport and capacity building that we know will deliver impact. And those impact measures are things that we know we can value if we actually put values around activity, safety, access, comfort and policy. These are the things that we've learned, and I hope they might be of interest to you and the sorts of things that you could adopt to benefit pedestrians across Norway. And if you want to know more, we have a conference every year. We've never been to Norway yet, so we're always open to suggestions. But this year we'll be in Kigali in Rwanda, 16th to 19th of October. We'll be talking about road safety, low-income communities, climate solutions, particularly relating to this COP. It's something coming up where walking is very much on the agenda. So we're exploring that, and also governance and finance. Hope to see you there. But thank you very much for your attention today and for your interest in walkable cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much so far, Jim Walker from Walk 21. Here in the studio, we also have some Norwegian experts on walking as a mode of transport. Both Guro Berge and Marianne Knapskog is now working in TØI, Norwegian Center of Transport Research. And I do know that you have some questions for Jim.
Yes, it was very interesting to hear your 8-step project or action plan actually. And I think it's what is very important here, I think, is it's knowledge. It comes into almost all of these steps that people need knowledge about what is good for people and what is good for the city and how to make more people walk. And I think and research, of course, is a very important part of that. And as you said, 50% of the time people are walking outside in the city, they are waiting. They are standing and waiting. And of course, to find out better ways of using your time than waiting is a good action plan, actually. But I think you also said that these shopkeepers was one of those groups that were against this walkability, making streets walkable. Could you tell a little more about the other people who are in conflict with this initiative, or is it what groups are against and what groups are supporting these initiatives with walkability?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's an interesting thing because, you know, the traditional way that transport investment happens is based around time savings, whereas with walking, it's not so much time savings. Quite often, a good walk, you're teased by the experiences. You know, you want to be able to sort of pop into a shop, have a chat with a friend, you know, be lured by the smell of a coffee maybe. And of course, that's how society works, you know, to pop into a park and sit down, as you say. Actually, for walking, 50% of your time is what the French would call sojourning, if it translates. And it's important to plan for that. So it's not about time, it's time quality. I think that's what's important. And that means we have to put changes in the way that we appraise schemes. And I think that this talks about how we actually build a community of support around this conversation as well. Because if we value the right things and put value on that conversation time, a value on that sitting time, the chance to meet friends and things, then these are sort of social values. These are things that communities do support. As I say, we talk about retailers being concerned that maybe it's people can't park outside their stores. Maybe they won't be able to actually be shopping. But, we've seen studies all over the world where it's actually people who walk to stores. They go more often and over the course of a week spend more. But if we measure the single shop, and we say, how much did you spend today as a driver or a pedestrian? Then it might be that the driver looks like they're spending more. But if we change the question, they're going back more regularly and they're spending 3-4 times as much as a pedestrian than the motorist. That's what we found in lots of places. So I think there are supporters everywhere, but it's framing the conversation so that we're talking about social values, economic values, health values. These are things that actually prop up our society. They're the foundation of a successful place. So, we talk about walking, but walking is really just an indicator of a successful place, which is, of course, where we all want to live.
Yeah, I agree with you. And sojourning is also a very important part of walking in cities. But just to wait crossing, that's maybe not worth the time. But that's also why we have in our strategy also these benches. We want more benches outside in the city center, so people can both rest and also meet, and also have non-commercial places to sit in the city, and that's very important. So, and I just want to say that we had one research in one little town in Norway. They wanted to take out the parking places, and the shopkeepers were, really angry. And they did a study, and they found out that people parking in the area was most people working in the shops, not customers. So then they had a different attitude, and that's why I mean that all this knowledge and the research is very important to get the support and proofs about how important it is to make a place more walkable. And I think also that the difference between walkable and walked is very important. It was very, very nice. I like this figure you had. And also, it's not only about investments in infrastructure, but also I would say, nudging people to walk and to take away the car. The immediate, the first choice should not be the car, it should be walking. So have you done anything on the specific of nudging people to walk?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Probably for the first 10 years of Walk 21, we worked largely in European contexts and in the States, reminding people that walking can be a nice thing to do. It's relatively straightforward to know how to do that. Most people recognize it's good for your health and good for the environment, and that can be good enough. But in lots of places where we've worked with health authorities, for example, they know that they want to get people to walk more. I think Mick Cornett, who was mayor of Oklahoma City, is the most famous for this. He had a heart attack, and he was very overweight man. I think he had a huge pair of trousers that he was obese, and his doctor said to him, if you don't walk every day, you'll be dead within the next year. He opened his front door on the first day, and he said, well, where are all the footpaths? And they'd forgotten to build them. Yeah. And he went back to his doctor and he said, just how many people are like me in this city? And to cut a long story short, he put the whole city on a diet. He's written a book about it called City on a Diet. And he now walks around with this pair of trousers, huge pair of trousers, and he's a much thinner man, mainly because they built footpaths. Yeah. They put the footpaths retrofitted back into the neighborhoods and people went out again. If we don't provide these basic facilities, seating, like you mentioned, the footpath, nice places, trees, some parks, if we don't build these things, people won't use them. But everywhere in the world where they're built, they are appreciated. And it's a simple thing, but it does need a plan. It needs to be remembered.
Marianne?
Yeah, I was wondering, a little bit more about advocacy and the use of advocates. How do you inspire people to become advocates for walking in their cities? Because in Norway, most of the plans are made by public authorities, either the municipalities or the public roads administration. But we've seen, for example, from Scotland, that they use charities and intermediaries also as an important part of making the policy and maybe fulfilling the policy. So I was wondering if you can say something about the importance of this and how we can include them in our work with walking strategies.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. What we have seen in a number of places, you mentioned Scotland as an example, is that when you sort of outsource from central government, the sort of fine detail, it does help with the delivery side. Because really for walking, a lot of things are quite small that need to get changed. I ran a project for the mayor in London for 9 years. We identified in a walking network 14,000 things that needed to change on that network. And each year he gave me £1 million to spend on making improvements. And over 9 years, I got all 14,000 things done. But, you know, these are small things. I mean, sometimes they're road crossings, junction improvements, but it can be wayfinding, it can be benches, like you say, tree planting, small things that often get lost in a big scheme. And I think this is the challenge that we find in lots of countries, is that when people apply for a big project, and of course walking's included, typically maybe a railway station is improved or a bus station is put in. They've just done one of those in Nigeria, in Ikeja, for example, in Lagos. World Bank funded the bus station, but there's a 6-lane highway to get in and out of it, and not a single crossing. They're expecting 1 million people to go in and out the bus station, but you can only get in and out on the bus. and it's like there's money for the bus station, but not money for the walkability. And often when projects overrun, it's the walking part that gets dropped off. It's the small things that seem quite cheap, but they can be so essential for everyday accessibility, satisfaction, you know, quality of life. And I think agencies sometimes can be quite helpful to actually pick up that detail, make sure that the detail that matters to everyday lives actually gets the investment and the change happens on the street. So yes, I think that can be helpful. But the thing about campaigners, I think, you know, what we found over the years is that our campaigners can be on the inside. They can be practitioners. They can be politicians. They can be even funders. We need people who understand the issue and are willing to be champions for it. And so maybe champions, campaigners, it's a slightly different thing. But, you know, once people get it, there's no going back. And I think I interviewed someone the other day from the Netherlands, for example. He's in charge of walking policy in the Netherlands. He was a politician. He then saw a gap. And he saw the gap because his wife said to him, she didn't want to cycle around the Netherlands. She wanted to walk. But actually, she felt afraid for the cyclists. And his neighbour was quite elderly and was not choosing to go out anymore because she found that it was quite difficult to cross the street. He's left being a politician and started writing a walking policy for the Dutch government for them because he saw a policy gap. And I think once you've been inspired by some real life people, I think it's really helpful to be able to sort of work out how to improve their lives, and improving lives of the elderly and women, in that example, will help improve the lives of many citizens in your cities.
Guro?
Yeah, just one last question. We have investments in infrastructure, and we have campaigns and nudging, what we can call it. But we also have regulatory measures. And for instance, speed limits. Europe had an initiative for many years ago for 30 kilometers per hour in city centers and where people are living and walking. How is that going? Is that what happened to that initiative?
It's so important, speed. It's interesting. It was only in Stockholm in 2020 when the ministers met and made this new declaration for road safety. That it was the first time, 2020, where walking and cycling were seen as a solution to road safety. I think it's fair to recognise that until that point, very often ministers had thought that the best way to make streets safer was to get people out of the way. to actually, if people were protected inside their cars, then we would reduce crashes. Across Europe in particular, but actually mostly globally, the whole situation is still bad. It hasn't got safer to walk in most places. Norway is the exception. Oslo in particular, of course, is a shining global example. But in most places, they fix making cars safer, not making it safer for pedestrians. Speed is the issue. It is an issue that can really help things. But to actually manage speed, it takes a systems approach. And that means that we're not just about putting a different speed limit on the streets. It's what's the driven speed can be affected by the type of vehicle, and particularly road design, of course, and driver behavior. And so some of our campaigning work that we're talking about is not necessarily reminding people to walk anymore. I said we did that for 10 years in the north, but actually in the global south for the last 10 years, we've been working at how to reduce aggressive driving behavior and inappropriate driving speeds to actually protect people. So it's nudging drivers as strongly as possible, using every opportunity to actually protect people, particularly when there isn't the infrastructure there to look after them either. So speed is absolutely critical, but how we get there requires a package of measures.
Jim, we have also gotten some online questions from the audience via Slido. Here's one. In meetings, the conditions for cyclists often dominates the discussions, although walking is priority one. How can we change this?
Fantastic. Thank you. Look, the thing is, we're often put together as active travel. And when you do that, and when governments do this, then yes, basically, in most cases, the money gets spent on cycling. There's clearer demand about what the infrastructure is, and it's clear there are strong campaigners for it. And and I think people see it as an attractive, quick solution. And we've got, of course, our cyclists are our friends, but it's really important not to put them together and fall into this lazy habit. Just because we are both non-motorized, or both active, it's a lazy grouping. Our best friends are actually public transport. If you think about it, the biggest gains in cities is actually encouraging walking and public transport. 80 to 85%, it's Helge Hilnerhutte from TNO who's done this, leading this global research, a Norwegian, who recognizes that it's catchment quality that can actually encourage and sustain public transport behavior. And if we really want successful, sustainable, healthy, clean, safe cities, then it's a matter of actually investing in walking and walkable catchments for public transport. And so these are our best friends, and we're really delighted that the future really is about those relationships with people like Alstom, who've been in contact with us recently. They build train carriages, and they say, if we could use our audit tool, like I showed you in Medellin, to actually explore walking catchments of public transport, then it's likely that more people will be using public transport. And if they do so, they might need to buy more train carriages. And we've suddenly found a sort of harmonious relationship where we both get along. And I think it's actually, if we think about it, it's the quickest, most reliable and cheapest way of actually coming up with a safe, sustainable transport solution for the planet and addressing the climate emergency. And that's the message we'll be taking to the climate talks in November, December in UAE later this year.
Jim, we are coming back to you, but now I want to ask Marianne and Guro a couple of questions. And unfortunately in Norwegian. Guro, du var jo prosjektleder for nasjonal gåstrategi. Verdens første nasjonale gåstrategi. Vi krangler vel litt med Skottland om det. Men,
Vi er litt foran.
Ja, litt foran. Ja. Og det var 11 år siden. Hva vil du si er status nå?
Ja, altså status for det første så har vi jo satt opp en del sånne indikatorer eller sånn som vi ønsker å liksom teste på. Det jo om vi går mer, om det flere som går. Det jo liksom de hovedmålsetningene som vi har med strategien. Og vi har jo sett at det flere, altså transportmiddelfordelingen har vært i fordel for de gående nå de siste årene, men vi kan på en måte ikke stole helt på det på grunn av pandemien, fordi at under pandemien så har flere begynt å gå i nærmiljøet sitt. Så vi vet jo ikke helt om denne endringen har stått seg eller ikke. Så det gjenstår å se da. Så på selve adferden så det I hvert fall det litt flere som går, og på oppmerksomhet så har de gående kommet liksom mer opp på dagsorden. Så sånn sett hadde den strategien veldig mye å si for å få det opp på en sånn politisk nivå. Og så hadde vi jo et ønske om å ha 50 lokale gåstrategier innen 2023, var det vel, innen I år. Det vet jeg ikke helt om vi har fått til.
Men det ganske mange, Marianne, ikke det?
Jo, for Marianne har jo gjort et studie av dette, så det kan du si litt om.
50 kanskje var mange, men vi ser, når vi har sett, vi har hatt et annet prosjekt, og der har vi fått sett litt på hva som gjort I norske steder. Og da finner vi jo at det både store og små byer som har laget en gåstrategi, og selv om de ganske forskjellige, så tar alle sammen utgangspunkt I den nasjonale gåstrategien.
Kan du nevne noen eksempler?
Ja, da for eksempel så det var da Haugesund for eksempel som begynte med å lage en gåstrategi, og en av de siste eller store også Bergen som også har laget en kommunedelplan for gange og også fulgt opp med en handlingsplan. Og det samme gjelder også Ås som også har laget en plan etter plan- og bygningsloven for gange og sykling. Så men der kommer det jo inn det her vi som kom opp her I sted, det forrige spørsmålet, at av og til så det sykling som utløser et planarbeid.
Men hvorfor, du spurte jo om dette med sånn en forening eller interessegruppe, og det har vi jo fremdeles ikke klart å få helt få gjennomført I dag. Vi har jo det ta fortauene tilbake, som har jo men det en veldig sånn spesifikk oppgave som de har påtatt seg, og det å nettopp ta fortauene tilbake fra sparkesykler. Så vi håper jo at de kan ta et litt sånn større grep da. Så, og jeg tror vi trenger noen til å dytte myndigheter og hele tiden være på. Og det har vi ikke faktisk hatt I Norge. Vi prøvde jo å få turistforeningen til å ta det grepet, men de har ikke helt hoppet på det agnet.
Ja. Vi nærmer oss slutten nå, men jeg tror vi må nevne 2 TØI-prosjekter som sikkert nyttig for mange av dem som ser på. For dere har jo utviklet en egen metodikk for gåvennlighet I norske byer. Kan du si kort?
Ja, så det stemmer jo ganske godt overens med det her trinnet til Jim om å kartlegge. Og så vi har laget en kartleggingsmetodikk som vi tenkte som skulle være enkel I bruk, men som da I tillegg til å se på det her med infrastruktur og transport, også ser på det her med bymessighet og på omgivelser og opplevelser. Og vi mener alle 3 viktige for å få til gangvennlighet I et område, og for å få et helhetlig bilde. Og det en metode da, som vi tenker, som baserer seg på feltarbeid og bruk av eksisterende data og spørreundersøkelser. Og målet var som sagt da, å lage en metode som var lett å ta I bruk for planleggere I kommuner. Og I etterkant så har da for eksempel Sandefjord brukt vår metode når de har laget sin gåstrategi.
Du, også Marianne, vi må nevne litt Walkmore-prosjektet. Kan du forklare litt kort hva det for noe?
Ja, det da et prosjekt som en TØI har sammen med NMBU som forskningspartner, og så det jo også dere med I Statens vegvesen med, og de som jobber med gåstrategi I Statens vegvesen. Og da prøver vi både å få mer kunnskap om gange, og teste ut tiltak og lage gåstrategier I mindre byer. Og da har vi Narvik, Steinkjer og Kongsvinger som case, og da det både kommunene og fylkeskommunene for de tilhørende fylkeskommunene som deltar aktivt inn I prosjektet.
Tusen takk. Da går vi tilbake til Jim. You're soon coming to Bergen. What is happening? Why are you going to Bergen in 2 weeks?
Yeah, it'll be my first time in Norway in all these years, so I'm excited about that. Bergen is one of part of an Interreg project that we're supporting as an expert partner called Active Cities. Bergen wants to be a more active city. I think they've just opened this tunnel, which is meant to be particularly good for walkers and cyclists. We're coming to see that and think about these mobility hubs. So what I was talking about public transport, you know, how could we use a big piece of infrastructure like this to inspire maybe changes in behavior, shortcuts through the city like Munich did, and think about increasing the activity overall for walking and cycling across Bergen. So I'll be there in a couple of weeks.
Good. Thank you so much, Jim, for joining us. Thank you. Tusen takk også til Guro Berge og Marianne Knapskog, og til min gode kollega Anna Kastratovic Johansen. Vi tilbake med ny Bylunsj om 2 uker. Da tema innstramming av gatekryss. Hvordan vi mye bedre kryss på en enkelt og effektiv måte kan gi en mye bedre by. Eller bedre byer. Da skal vi få høre fra Ida Bergene Kongsrud fra Bymiljøetaten I Oslo. Tusen takk for nå, og ha en god dag videre.